Just outside Peking is a quiet little backwater of history. Picturesque, overgrown ruins, which are evidence of the West's impact on China more than 200 years ago. Even at first glance, you can see among the ruins fragments of buildings in a European style, with European decorative motifs, European architectural conventions. These ruins are all that's left of a group of palaces built for the Emperor of China in the middle of the 18th century. But they were built and designed for him by European architects. Jesuits, as it happens. Other emperors seeking a refuge from the heat of Peking had built summer palaces too, but not like these. These were an act of cultural homage, one of China's rare borrowings of Western style. We know what those ruined buildings once looked like because the Jesuits left us engravings of them. They're housed in the Oriental collection at the British Museum. These were almost certainly the first, and for a long time, they were the only buildings in European style to be seen in China. Very impressive they must have looked, like Baroque palaces you might see all over Europe. Those palaces were destroyed in 1860 and destroyed by British soldiers, part of an Anglo-French expeditionary force which was under the command of Lord Elgin. Not the Lord Elgin of the Parthenon marbles, which can be found just down the corridor from here, but his son, a man who became ambassador to the court of Peking. And they weren't just destroyed by soldiers running amok. They were destroyed deliberately. It was a sort of symbol of a clash of two civilizations. Elgin ordered the destruction of the palaces in order to demonstrate the strength of an idea, the idea of the universal applicability of Western justice. What had happened was that some European hostages had been maltreated and then murdered by Chinese officials. Some said at the direct instigation of the emperor himself. So, said Lord Elgin, the emperor's own personal property should bear the weight of reprisal. And in that way, it would be shown that Western justice was indeed universally applicable and implacable. 1860 is not very long ago, and now, to a remarkable extent, ideas about the way nations should behave to one another and obey the same rules, ideas drawn from Western notions, are in fact applied virtually all the world round. But they aren't imposed by Europeans by force anymore, as Elgin thought he had to impose them. Indeed, the days when Europeans could do that sort of thing, when the men of the West could make and remake the habits of other civilization, now seem unimaginably remote. They're ancient history. Yet today, the civilization to which they belonged, the Western civilization, is still threatening and challenging other cultures, other ways of life, in many, many ways. Western fashion is imitated the world round. It's big business. But there's more to it than that. It's part of a package of assumptions that comes with the consumer society, a package that signals liberation, a freer, less formal life, above all, for young people. The West has left its stamp on the appearance of cities the world round, too. In Hong Kong, a Chinese city at the edge of the world's oldest civilization, the buildings imitate the international style of the capitalist world. Far to the north, in China itself, Peking has borrowed for its architecture another Western style, that of Soviet communism, the source of China's official ideology. It was in the name of that Western ideology that China broke free of its past in 1947. The regime formally embraced the militant revolutionary ideology of Karl Marx and Lenin. And with those ideas came much else from the West: technology, science, even an imitation of a certain official style. And now, nearly 40 years after the revolution, China seems to be trying to imitate the West in other ways. The encouragement of private enterprise, however cautious, must also encourage the emergence of a consumer society. That could prove to be far more corrosive of Chinese ways than even Marxist-Leninism. What will happen when Chinese see income as something to be spent rather than saved? What will that do to their traditional thrift, to their expectations, and their economic goals? The regime is usually at pains to present China's recent history as a story of resistance to the West, at least in its overt forms. The History Museum in Peking is full of relics and representations of past Western aggression and Chinese resistance to it. This diorama shows heroic Chinese workers executing summary justice on Franciscan friars late in the 19th century because the friars were said to murder Chinese babies for the ritual of the Mass. And the essentially reactionary Boxer movement of 1900, a xenophobic outburst of anti-Western feeling in defense of Chinese tradition, is nonetheless portrayed simply as a rout of foreign intruders, Americans, Germans, English and French alike. The Boxers are shown as heroic and invincible, and that's ironic because they're painted not in a traditional Chinese style, but in a Western way borrowed from the Russians. The complexity of official China's attitudes to Western culture can be seen in the ideas of Mao himself. He was respected as a calligrapher and a poet in the traditional style of a Chinese ruler. Nevertheless, he threw the Chinese people into a frenzied attempt to abolish all that remained of older Confucian China, the Cultural Revolution. Respect for scholars was derided. The family, which was the very heart of Chinese society, was undermined. A peculiarly intransigent Chinese communism was enforced with terrible brutality. It was, in a way, a perverted triumph of modernization, and therefore of westernization. True, Mao's Cultural Revolution had also driven into hiding all manifestations of Western art and music. But now, European grand opera is back in the repertoire at Peking. But Mao's sense that his revolution might be undermined by cultural forces, be they traditional or Western, was well founded. The West threatens and changes societies and cultures everywhere. It has glamour, and so it's been imitated, often grotesquely, by those who wanted to borrow the prestige of a culture they believed superior. The Emperor Bokassa of the Central African Republic arranged his coronation ceremony to look, as he thought, like the crowning of a European monarch. His robes, copied from those of the great Napoleon, were ordered from France, as were his crown and regalia. Bokassa was trying to play a role drawn from the theatre of European monarchy, where it had played successfully for over 1,000 years. Bokassa's infatuation is another example of the seductive, corrosive power of the West. It seems to lure all mankind towards its own values, standards, and yardsticks. The last 20 years have seen a renewal of belief in the power of the faith throughout the Islamic world. To many Muslims, it seemed that a century of humiliation at the hands of the Western powers has ended. The tables have been turned. Status and dignity are being restored to peoples who have not known them for a long time. Islam now has something like 500 million believers. It's the second largest religion in the world and the fastest growing. Its focus is Mecca, the place of pilgrimage to which the pilgrims flock in their hundreds of thousands every year. Many of them come from lands into which Islam was carried by conquest centuries ago. Those conquests were followed by the golden age of Islamic culture, when in science, medicine, philosophy, the arts, even in its material life, Islam easily outstripped Christian Europe. For centuries, Muslim holy men have taught that no ultimate reconciliation is possible between Islam and the non-Islamic world. Islamic history has often been punctuated by calls to arms against the infidel, as well as by religious revivals in response to failures by Islamic regimes to live up to the teaching of the Prophet. The most striking example of recent years has been in Iran. Their fundamentalist leaders have tapped deep sources of frustration and anger, which have exploded in an orgy of resentment against the West. It was not always so. Muslim leaders have sometimes turned to the West with admiration and with hope. Muhammad Ali was Pasha of Egypt in the early 19th century. When Bonaparte's soldiers had come to Egypt in 1798, they had brought with them to the Islamic world the first exhilarating whiff of the principles and ideas of the French Revolution. Muhammad Ali saw in such ideas valuable weapons in his attempts to assert an Egyptian identity and his own independence from the Ottoman Empire, whose somewhat unsatisfactory servant he was. The Ottoman Empire was the last great empire of Islamic history, and it was ruled from Istanbul, the Christian Constantinople, which the Turks had seized in 1453. From Constantinople, the Sultan ruled lands from North Africa to Mesopotamia, from the Arabian Peninsula to the valley of the Danube, and over peoples both Muslim and Christian. By the end of the 19th century, though, the empire was a shadow of its former self. Its new palaces, far from reflecting Islamic vitality, were only feeble imitations of Western grandeur. The Ottoman court, from which all power was meant to radiate, was notoriously corrupt, incompetent, overextended, decadent. Nonetheless, the authority of the Caliph, which the Sultan was supposed to exercise, derived from the Prophet himself. While the court was a byword for ineffectiveness, predatory European powers were eating away at the Ottoman territories. The empire was, in the words of a Russian Tsar, the sick man of Europe. As the empire moved towards the Great War, her capital looked superficially westernized. But she was still a great Islamic power. Yet from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire was to emerge a modern, secular Turkey. The story of how that happened is inseparably linked with the name of one man, Kemal Atatürk. Kemal was a professional soldier, made famous by a great exploit at Gallipoli, where his brilliant leadership produced one of the few Turkish victories of the war. He also showed formidable ability both as a battlefield commander and as a staff officer. Before the war, Kemal had dabbled in secret political societies. He now became a nationalist who saw the future not in terms of a multinational Islamic empire, but of a true Turkish national state. After the war, he began to plan to overthrow the Sultan and to liberate Turkish territory from the victorious Allies. His supporters called him by an ancient title, Ghazi, or Champion of the Faith. This was a misnomer. He'd been brought up a Muslim, but was to reveal himself as a progressive, secular modernizer, taking as his model Western ideas and skills, which he'd admired long before 1914. In 1923, a Turkish republic was proclaimed, with Kemal as president. He'd spurned the office of Sultan. He presided over a representative assembly, but for all that, he was more of a dictator than a democrat. For Kemal's modernization to work, he had to confront Islam. He abolished the caliphate, the Islamic courts, and all reference to religion in the constitution, and he abandoned the Islamic calendar. Islam, this theology of an immoral Arab, said Kemal, is a dead thing. Kemal wanted a new nationalism to fill the ideological vacuum left among his own countrymen by the collapse of Ottoman rule. The name Turkey had not been known in the country to which the West applied it. It was simply taken over from European languages and adopted by the new republic in 1923. The new name Kemal was given by his countrymen was Ataturk, Father Turk. When he died in 1938, the revolution had gone far enough for Kemal to consider his essential work done, and the Turkish national revolution complete. While Ataturk pursued his modernization program, attempts were being made in Europe to interest other Islamic rulers in the achievements of Western civilization. One of them was the young Shah of Persia. After Turkey, Persia was becoming one of the most important states in the Middle East because of her oil. And so the Shah was welcomed at Victoria Station by the future King George VI and taken on an expedition to shop for arms. After he'd returned to his still poor and backward country, presumably with happy memories of the glamour of his visit, it was only a short time before he was overthrown. That was in 1925. The new ruler was a soldier, Reza Khan, the father of the last Shah of Iran. His son was to write of him that his mind was always filled with visions of modern factories, dams, railways, cities, armies, and power plants. Oil and geographical position were to make Iran, as Persia became known, of vital strategic importance by the time of the Second World War.
This is the newsreel's record for history of the linking up of the British and Indian force in Iran with the army of the Soviet Union. The swift action that occupied a weak country in danger of falling into the grip of Hitler.
In the old days, the British and Russians had traditionally been rivals in Persia, but in 1941, they acted together to preempt a possible German invasion. They occupied the country. The Shah had been well disposed to the Germans. He'd flirted with fascism. In consequence, he was turned out by the Allies, who installed his son in his place. But when the war ended, it would no longer be so easy for Western powers blatantly to impose their will on other hitherto subservient nations. In 1947, in India, the great British Raj itself came to an end, and from it emerged, under the leadership of Muhammad Jinnah, a new Islamic state. Pakistan had all the appearance of a typical post-colonial liberal and democratic state, with a parliament, elections, an independent judiciary. Yet it was to be ruled according to Islamic law. It was a turning point. A year later, another new nation was born. In the Middle East, the state of Israel came into existence with American and Russian blessing and universal Arab hostility.
Senor Arana of Brazil, presiding, calls on the nations to vote and announces how they vote.
Saudi Arabia? No. Soviet Union? Yes. The United Kingdom? Abstain. The United States? Yes. The United Kingdom? Abstain. The United States? Yes. 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 The United States? Yes
The birth and then the rapid growth of Israel and the displacement of Palestinian refugees heightened the frustrations of Muslims everywhere, rulers and ruled alike. In some Arab eyes, Israel, with its Western supporters across the seas, was an intruder, a reincarnation of an old Crusader state or a new Western colony. Arab nationalism took on an increasingly anti-Western tone as Egypt's General Nasser exploited it. A frenzied wave of popular hostility towards the West reached its height in the Suez Crisis, when France and Britain in 1956 joined Israel in invading Egypt. There was to be more military humiliation for Arab countries to come. But in 1973, the Yom Kippur War led to modest Arab military success and dented the Israeli reputation for invincibility on the battlefield. More important, at that moment, the Arab states, in a rare display of unity, combined to use a new weapon against Israel's Western patrons. The Arabs had discovered a new sword of Allah, oil. The need for oil forced the great powers, Japan now among them, to take Muslims seriously as an international force for the first time since the heyday of the Ottoman Empire.
Persepolis, the birthplace of Persian history 2,500 years ago and destroyed by Alexander the Great in 330 BC. Here today, in celebration of the monarchy's 25 centuries of existence, Iranian soldiers recreated the military splendors of those ancient times.
In 1971, Muslim fundamentalists had been outraged that the Shah's dynastic celebrations had evoked a pre-Islamic Persia. The son of Reza Khan looked back to the great days of an empire which existed centuries before Muhammad, to Darius, to Xerxes.
In 529 BC.
They were outraged further by the opulence and corruption of the Shah's style of government. His westernization, paid for by oil sales to the West, had moved so fast that the social and cultural dislocation was especially hard to bear in a still backward pre-industrial nation. And westernized liberals hated the Shah too, for his cruelty, ruthlessness, and the oppressiveness of his regime. Revulsion took a long time to come to a climax. When it did, it was sweeping and far-reaching. The fundamentalists turned on all would-be modernizers and westernizers with the pent-up emotions of frustrated Muslim believers. Ataturk was remembered with particular hatred. Had he not once called the Prophet immoral and abolished the veil? Reza Shah had taken the non-Islamic name of Pahlavi. That was wrong too. When the Shah went into exile in 1979, it was clear that westernization, far from succeeding in Iran, had touched off the greatest explosion of anti-Western feeling since the Crusades. The whole package, long advocated by reformers, seemed to have been returned to its donors. To explore the complexity of Islam's response to challenges from the West, we went to one of the most remote and traditional corners of the Arabian Peninsula, which is the very heartland of the Arab Islamic world, where the faith of Islam is still nearest to its ancient roots. This is the Sultanate of Oman, and this is its ancient capital, Muscat. It stands at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, halfway between Basra and Bombay. For centuries, it was a focal point of Arab sea power and Arab trade. There were Christians here before Islam arrived in the 7th century. But since it came, it's always been an Islamic stronghold. In the interior, there are people who still practice a particularly ancient and austere and somewhat puritanical form of Islam. On the coast, the Omanis had been in touch with Europe from the beginning of the 16th century, when the Portuguese arrived here on their great voyages of trade and discovery. In due course, they built these forts. Vasco da Gama's pilot on his historic voyage from Africa to India had been an Omani seaman. From protected harbours such as this, the Portuguese could sally forth and prey on the shipping of the Gulf and the Indian Ocean. They were, in effect, pirates for a century or more, until they were driven out in the 1640s. After that, the rulers of Muscat used their own sea power to build up their own maritime empire, a huge one, which stretched round the Arabian Peninsula as far as Zanzibar. They built up a great trade in black slaves. They signed a treaty with the British. But Oman still lived at the edge of history, untroubled by the rise and fall of historical tides that were shaping the rest of the world. That is, until 1970. Oman then emerged from hermit-like isolation to join the 20th century, the last of all the Arab states to do so. And Oman, too, has had to negotiate terms with the encircling civilization of the West. Only 15 years ago, most of Oman looked like this. It was a society that seemed to have changed little since the followers of the Prophet swept through it in the 7th century. The people were ruled by a regime that was idiosyncratically repressive. Few foreign visitors were ever allowed, and then only reluctantly, into the country. The inhabitants of the interior were forbidden to travel to the coast. Those of the coast were not allowed into the interior. People were forbidden medicine, radio, music, dancing, trousers, cigarettes, and books. The Sultan had an aversion to educating the Omani children. That's why you lost India, he told a British advisor, because you educated the people. For a population ridden with endemic disease like malaria, leprosy, tuberculosis, trachoma, there was only one hospital, and that was run by Americans. However, here as elsewhere in Arabia, oil was the genie in the bottle. Oman in the 1960s became too important to be left in medieval obscurity. A coup d'etat with the connivance of the British removed the reactionary old Sultan, who was packed off to exile at Claridge's Hotel in London. A triumph for the West End, so to speak. His son, who succeeded him as Sultan, was a very different man. Trained at Sandhurst, he'd served with a Scottish regiment. Then he'd worked in local government in England. Sultan Qaboos was 30 when he came to the throne. He threw himself into the task of modernizing Oman. Oil revenue financed a huge development program. British, Swedish, French contractors, Indian and Pakistani laborers were delighted to pour into the country, to transform what had been hitherto rock and desert. In 1970, there were only 10 cars in the country. Now there are 20,000. Roads have been built for them. Public education, long deferred, has now begun. And yet, for all the symbols of modernization, Oman is still very much a part of the greater society of believers. very far from being fanatics, its rulers are determined that none of the changes that are being made should damage the Islamic heart of the country. Omanis believe that controlled and selective modernization is possible. They believe they can choose what they want from the West and reject what they do not. Can they succeed? Even if you try to pick and choose, can you avoid becoming dependent? Contamination comes in so many forms. New international hotels can accelerate the erosion of a country's personality. In the baggage of the multinational employees who come here to work come challenging ideas, standards, methods. But there's more than that to a place like this. Inequalities between rich and poor stand out here with new starkness, wearing away the values of a society where economic change was hardly conceivable only a few years ago. In the past, it was easy to agree about things like right and wrong, justice and injustice. Uncertainty will grow with the loss of shared feeling that went with the old static order. The souks still look as they've done for centuries. But the goods for sale in them are now part of a universal bazaar. They're manufactured in Taiwan, India, Korea, China, Hong Kong, Japan. Products of the East, but hardly any longer of any particular place or culture. Just part of a standardized worldwide department store. Goods once luxuries are now taken for granted. Rising expectations have become almost universal. Here, as elsewhere, consumer goods shatter the ties that bind people to their past. Even if co-education is as yet unimaginable in Oman, these girls are being taught the same curriculum as boys. Education, however closely controlled, encourages new mental attitudes, which gradually prize apart old mental and cultural worlds. These girls are learning a Western approach to problems, an approach which asks awkward questions, which confronts awkward answers, which believes that progress lies in the power of reason rather than in the scrutiny of sacred texts, be they Bible or Quran. Educating women in a society like this must mean educating them for emerging opportunities, the new roles that will go with new jobs in hospital wards, offices, the police, public services, communications. And elsewhere, their life will be transformed by technology. Even the arrival of something as simple as electricity or running water in a home can change lives in a liberating way. And of course, so can literacy. For one thing, it will release upon underdeveloped countries the full force of something which has been one of the greatest agents of change in women's lives in the West. Commercial advertising, with its continuous presentation of new goals to be achieved, new assumptions about what is appropriate behavior, new models of life. Why, it's even begun already all over the world to affect standards of feminine beauty. All over the world you will find women who, through their hairstyles, their makeup, their clothes, express an idea of feminine glamour whose origins lie ultimately in the cinema and the fashion magazines. It's not really surprising that some Muslims have begun to feel that their society and its conception of womanhood faces a fundamental challenge of a new and unprecedentedly dangerous kind. It's hard to believe that this generation, confronted by the emancipating temptations of the consumer society and individual choice, will settle as easily as their mothers did for arranged marriages and subservient roles in public and private life. It's sometimes hard not to regret the destruction of old societies. Old ways of life can seem more precious to outsiders like myself than to those who've been obliged to live with them for so many years. But it seems certain that the forces at work for change, be they education or piped water, will be irresistible. There is no easy way to be sure of preserving the core and identity of an old society which is taking so many things from the West. The civilization which has so much that Oman needs. This is Oman's first university, now near to opening. It's going to have a splendid set of buildings, housing 3,000 students on a large site, hitherto desert. And it will have many of the usual things we associate with universities in the West: laboratories, libraries, even a concert hall. Sultan Qaboos University will concentrate on providing the engineers, doctors, scientists and teachers that Oman needs and has at the moment to import. To me, as an academic, that seems a clear-headed and sensible choice of priorities, and they will be embodied in a mold which is very much marked by Western traditions. British academic visitors who come here in a few years will find much that is very familiar. The main academic branches of the university will be presided over by officers called deans. People will proceed to take bachelor's degrees. The communities in which the students live will be very much like the halls of residence or colleges of a British university. And yet, there will also be great differences. Men and women students, for example, will be segregated even in some of their academic work. At lectures, they will sit apart, and the women students will enter and leave the room by doors different from those of the men. That's because the university is intended to embody certain social and ethical purposes. That's not a way in which the British university is often seen nowadays, though perhaps it was more common once upon a time. But those purposes are, of course, not drawn from the Western tradition, but from the Muslim. The planners of Sultan Qaboos University wanted to take not merely what was best and most useful as they saw it in the Western university, but also they wanted to retain, secure, perhaps even strengthen Oman's own cultural tradition, rooted in Islam. As the prospectus puts it, the inculcation of Islamic values, intellectual discipline and character building will be emphasized, along with the acquisition of academic and professional qualifications. Many of us might sympathize with such an aim, but it would be hard now to find anyone talking language like that in the Western academic environment, with its bias towards the individual, its distrust of paternalism, its pluralism of values, and above all, its complete uncertainty about what should be the relationship between the university and society. And of course, it's not possible to say whether even in Oman, forever, it will be possible to keep in balance the Western model of the university and the Islamic ideal. Institutions have a way of taking on a life of their own, whatever their founders may have intended. What will be the effect of teaching science in universities, or indeed in schools and hospitals? Science is a terrible and fundamentally transforming force, not easily contained. Western science shows its power most obviously to non-scientists in technology and medicine. Healing the sick has always been one of the most striking manifestations of what Western civilization can do. Yet it's hard to square scientific method with the assumptions of many a traditional society. It can lead to a sort of mental schizophrenia in the Western trained members of that society, or perhaps to cynicism. It's not a stabilizing force. With medicine and science comes yet more of the Western package of rising expectations. Will the Islamic peoples, and for that matter, those of the rest of the world, follow those of the West in thinking that any physical or mental pain ought somehow in principle to be removable? If so, this will be a psychological gift of the West to the rest of humankind that will have great and incalculable, perhaps terrible consequences. Though the West may be notionally rejected, even dismissed as spiritually barren, it often turns out to be needed. The Islamic rejection takes place in the confidence that the West will go on creating the things Islam wants, that they will be there, available, neutral, on sale in that universal bazaar. One observer, the writer V.S. Naipaul, has detected what he calls a lie in the soul of the Islamic rejection of the West. He glimpses there an expectation of others continuing to create, of the alien necessary civilization going on. Is Islam parasitic upon a Western civilization which it rejects emotionally, but which it cannot do without? Or can Islam build something new for the future out of its contact with the universal Western civilization? Can Islamic fervor be channeled to become a creative force, revolutionary in other senses than the Ayatollahs, and so generate a renaissance which embraces the new as Muslims once did before in their glorious history, when they opened themselves to the learning of the world and then surpassed it? And if now people sometimes think that the West has nowhere to go, has no direction ahead, they might also reflect that to the rest of mankind, the West gave the notion that the human race can go somewhere, that tomorrow can be different, tomorrow can be better. There, for me, lies the greatest triumph of the West.